I'm Jason Lewis.
And I'm Flora Gladwin.
And I'm Thomas Mills.
Welcome to Climate Optimists. As a couple concerned citizens, we're on a journey to explore climate solutions and ways each of us can make a difference. As a nonprofit organization, it's donations from listeners that enable us to educate and empower people to become climate advocates. So whether you're a longtime listener or you just discovered us and you like what you hear, consider a donation that aligns with that value.
Donating is easy. Just head over to our website, climateoptimist.co, and click the donate button. If you're not ready to take the step to becoming a donor, but want to help us out, tell your friends, your grandma, your coworker about us, and rate us on your streaming platform.
Great point, Flora. The reviews, ratings, and definitely the recommendations to friends add up in the form of new listeners. So thanks for your help there. So as this year's wildfire season draws to a close in at least Western North America, many of us are finally breathing a sigh of relief as well as cleaner air. And that's good news. And it's also an important opportunity to refocus our attention on the greater challenge, addressing the increasing risk of wildfire driven by a warming climate and years of fire suppression. And as Canada's record wildfire season shows, the risk is spreading to forests that don't typically burn. So in today's episode, we dive into the world of wildfire, its natural role, its relationship to climate change, and most importantly, what we can do to help our forests become more resilient as temperatures rise. But before we introduce today's guest, let's talk about this week's reason for hope.
Yeah, thanks, Jason. So as many of us know, the COP28 conference or Conference of the Parties, which is basically the UN's climate conference, is coming up shortly in Dubai. And the EU has agreed on a position prior to this conference, and that will be that they will phase out unabated fossil fuel consumption. And I guess it's important to keep in mind that this word unabated, which is not clearly defined by them in this context, is a little bit of a hurdle, but at least this is a move in the right direction towards at least phasing out fossil fuels. So hopefully this is one of those things that, again, we see a trickle down and other nations start moving in the same direction. But as you and I spoke earlier about, Jason, I think the important thing at these conferences is some of these deals on the sideline where more developed nations help developing nations mitigate their fossil fuel use, even if there's no overwhelming agreement at these conferences, which of course we've not seen in the past. But anyway, basically a positive move.
Yeah, I'm with you. It's incremental, and it feels crazy that language hasn't already been adopted. But when you remember there's 200 nations that are involved in this, it's easy to see how you get stuck, right, with these oil producers like Saudi Arabia dragging their feet. One other potential benefit coming up with this conference is that the Pope is rumored to be going to attend. I heard like a 90% chance. And he's coming to help turn the screws on the politicians that, haven't yet had the spine to do the right thing. So good on the Pope.
And with that, let's get down to it. Let's introduce today's guest. Today we have Matt Hurteau joining us, who is a professor of quantitative ecology at the University of New Mexico. He has a BS in forestry from Northern Arizona University and a PhD in ecology from the University of California, Davis. His research focus is on climate change mitigation and adaptation in forest systems. So in other words, he is the perfect guest to help us explore today's topic.
Yeah, really excited to have him on. Matt, welcome to Climate Optimist.
Thanks, Jason.
So start you off with the question we do all our guests. When it comes to efforts to address climate change, what makes you hopeful?
Yeah, so really for me, from a forest ecologist perspective, it gets down to the Inflation Reduction Act and kind of the legislation that was passed a couple of years ago that really boosted funding for managing fire and restoring fire on federal lands in the country. And so that piece of legislation, I think the total was somewhere around $5.5 billion for forest restoration work. And, that's a nice down payment on kind of the backlog of work that needs to happen on restoring ecologically appropriate fire to our Western forests to help make them more resilient to changing climatic conditions.
And, I know sometimes the dollars can all feel big, but what kind of an annual budget would be? I mean, I'm guessing there's sort of what we need to spend to kind of catch up from being behind. And then there's like, what do you need to spend on an ongoing basis to make sure we're in a good spot? Do you have a sense of those dollar figures?
That's a really good and interesting question that I don't know there's a great answer for. So, one of the interesting things about fire in these ecosystems is that once you do get quote unquote caught up, you're trying to position the system to be able to receive fire in a way that's ecologically beneficial and also minimizes the hazard to society. And, if you get, quote unquote, caught up, like you've done that work across the landscape, then when ignitions happen, you can manage them to burn in an ecologically appropriate manner. And so it's basically this feedback process where, as more area gets treated with the right types of fire, we will end up spending less on suppression. But in the meantime, to give some perspective on that $5.5 billion number, so I live just south of the Santa Fe National Forest. And if you take all of the kind of dry, frequent fire forest types on the Santa Fe, all that land area, and just, back of the envelope calculation said every one of those acres needs to be treated, which is not true. But, let's just, for argument's sake, say they do.
Sure.
That would require $1.2 billion. So needless to say, 5.5 billion is a decent start, but it's just that, a start.
Right. Oh, that makes sense. Well, let's get back to like, I guess, big picture, starting kind of with the question that I think a lot of folks have. How are wildfires, both kind of contributing and being impacted by climate change?
I'm going to start with being impacted by part of the question first. And so, basically as the atmosphere heats up, it's able to hold more moisture. And so that's this condition we called atmospheric water demand or vapor pressure deficit. So it's how dry that atmosphere is and basically how much moisture it sucks out of the ecosystem. And so I like to think of the atmosphere as kind of a giant sponge that's constantly pulling moisture from the atmosphere or from the ecosystem, unless it's raining. And so basically, as the atmosphere pulls moisture from the ecosystem, it makes it a lot more flammable. And so, some colleagues of mine did an analysis that showed across the Western US since the mid 1980s, roughly half of the area burned. The cause was climate change, right? Was this dryness of fuel conditions because the atmosphere is drier. And then we published a paper last year led by Carolyn Wong about forest fire area burned. And it showed that, there's an exponential relationship with vapor pressure deficit. So as the drier the atmosphere becomes, the more area we expect to burn in a very, dramatic fashion in terms of forest fire area. And so that's kind of the climate change effects on flammability aspect, you
Sure.
know. And then in terms of wildfires contributing to climate change, my colleague Christine Widmeyer and I did an analysis maybe, 12 or 13 years ago now, looking at wildfire emissions versus prescribed fire emissions and the like. And, at the end of the day, they can be substantial from Western North America or North America in general, but they're really a small, very small fraction of our fossil fuel emissions.
Right.
So they're kind of, for North America, they're kind of irrelevant. I mean, they matter to some degree, but not as much as reducing fossil carbon emissions. Now, if we expand our look to the globally, there are fires burning in Indonesia right now. Every time we have an El Nino, Indonesia burns, and a lot of that carbon or a lot of those emissions are from peat, which is long sequestered carbon in the soil. So it's that organic soil. It dries out, it becomes flammable, and we're seeing just massive amounts of emissions from these peat fires, and that can have a significant effect on climate. So can high latitudes where if you're up in the kind of boreal system where there's very organic soils as well. High latitude in Canada this year, some of those fires are burning in places where they are burning into that organic soil, and that's releasing long stored carbon to the atmosphere. And so, of course, those are going to contribute to warming quite a bit.
So it sounds like depends on the forest type and the amount of, carbon you have stored in the soil and et cetera.
Yes.
When it comes to fires and firefighting, do you have a sense of kind of how much of the effort is focused on, kind of protecting structures versus sort of putting out the fire itself?
Yeah, so that's an interesting question from the perspective of how we allocate wildland fire resources as a whole, and then on the really big fires, right? And so, I think one of the things that I think most people don't quite comprehend is that we are incredibly successful at putting out fires in the United States. So, about 98% of fires that occur are caught and contained in what's called initial attack. So they start burning and a fire crew gets on it, and they scrape away fuels around it within that first burn period. And it's basically held at 1 to 10 acres, something like that, right? So really, really small. That's 98%. So it's really the other 2% of cases where, weather conditions are extreme, it supports rapid fire growth, and that fire escapes initial attack that are really problematic for us from a societal standpoint. And so when that happens, there's really no putting out the fire. Basically, all the firefighters can do is try and herd it in a direction where it's going to do the least amount of damage. And so we spend huge amounts of resources doing that. A lot of those resources are put into protecting structures and what firefighters refer to as values at risk. So that might be like power infrastructure, it might be any number of things that we as society deem important. But I think that one of the things we really need to be talking about are those other 98% of ignitions. And so many of those are occurring when weather conditions are mild, which is why we're able to catch them on initial attack. And we don't necessarily need to go right to fire suppression in those cases. And so the Wildland Fire Commission just released its report last week, and they make it clear that we really need to change our relationship with fire suppression. And to do that, we need to increase our wildland fire workforce so that we're better able to manage those ignitions to meet our objectives. So, when we have an ignition occur under relatively benign weather conditions and in a place where it's not threatening people's homes, if we have the human capital to manage that, we can let that fire burn in a controlled sort of way to help reduce fuels and reduce the chance of future extreme fires impacting our communities.
So it sounds like protecting, the structures and other, assets is a big part of it. I guess you're leading into sort of the core question, I think, at least that I have, which is how do we balance all this, right? Like, what's the approach that we need to be implementing to minimize that wildfire risk and risk of these sort of mega fires with like improving kind of forest resilience, et cetera?
Yeah, that's the kind of big question. So I think it really depends on forest type. I'm gonna generally divide our forests in the West into two kind of categories, and one would be the drier forest types that, these historically they burned very frequently. So every several years to several decades, you would have fire, and it's mostly on the forest floor. And then, I'll contrast that with what we call climate limited systems, which are systems that most years are not available to burn because they're either too wet or too cold. And then it's only when we have a drought or some extreme weather event that they become available to burn. Um, so in those really dry forest types, which honestly, outside of the Pacific Northwest, California, in the Rockies, that's where a lot of the kind of development in the wildland urban interface has occurred, is in these drier types. And so in a lot of these, there's an annual fire season. There's a period every year where that vegetation can burn. And they're what we call fuel limited systems. So it's only what prevents fire from occurring is when there's not enough fuel to support it. And so these are the types that we've most negatively impacted through fire suppression by keeping fire out of the system. They've gotten the tree density has increased a lot, and the dead fuels have built up on the forest floor. And by altering the forest structure and the fuels, we have increased the chance that fire moves from the forest surface into the canopy. And so, in these sorts of systems, we've got many decades of research that points to the fact that the best thing we can do is reintroduce ecologically appropriate fire. And so, that can be done by just bringing fire back in with prescribed burning or managing an ignition when weather conditions are benign. Or it can be the other end of the spectrum is maybe we're closer to communities, or it's a risky terrain for fire crews. And so there need to be some mechanical thinning first. So go and cut some of the trees down to create conditions that are safe to operate, and then put fire back into the system. And so, that's kind of the drier type.
So in those, it's really getting fire back in there in a way that is thoughtful, so that it has a chance to reduce those fuels, and then hopefully avoid the really ugly fires where you're burning, you're taking down all these trees as opposed to just getting rid of stuff on the forest floor.
Absolutely.
And then what about for these other systems you talked about, which I know we have a fair amount of those in the Northwest here, where it stays a little wetter certain parts of the year?
Yeah. So in those kind of climate limited systems, so most years they're not able to burn. The challenge, of course, with climate change is that, increasing variability from year to year, the projections all suggest that the burn window is going to change. They're going to become more flammable over time because of snow drought and higher temperatures and stuff like that. And so in these systems, there's been a fair amount of research by a bunch of different folks up in the Northwest looking at these systems in the mountains, and functionally what we've done from some fire exclusion, but also a lot of our past forest management practices is we've homogenized the forest. So we've got a lot of forest that is very similar in age. It's also a lot more connected now, right? And so those two things, like homogeneity, like making things very similar across the landscape, is a recipe for larger fires. And so what this work that's been done in Oregon and Washington shows is that, around the turn of the 20th century, we had forests in the mountains, but we also had a lot more meadows, and we had shrublands and stuff like that. And so the forest wasn't continuous. And that basically acted as a control on how big a wildfire could actually get. That variability also in terms of the kind of the age structure of the forest, and then variability in vegetation types across space, is also really good for a whole bunch of other ecosystem functions. And so the work that I've read from that area and the talks that I've seen from other researchers suggests that one of the things we need to do is reintroduce that heterogeneity into these systems. So a lot more variability across space.
So more different types of species, different ages. We don't have just sort of the classic where you look out and it's just this large blanket, all, in our case, it seems like Douglas fir trees and nothing
Yeah.
else. And then it sounds like having, more open spaces as well,
Yep.
in addition to those forest pockets. Just curious, are there certain, species of trees that are better equipped to deal with fire? And you're talking about the importance of diversity. Like, how do we kind of think about, I don't know if rehabilitation is the right word, but getting these ecosystems back into a place where they're going to be better equipped to deal with climate change, better equipped to deal with fire?
Yeah. I think that's one of the big questions that I think a lot of researchers are grappling with, and a lot of managers too, right? Trying to think about what's the species mix that makes our forests more resilient. But in terms of the kind of the evolutionary adaptation to deal with fire, I would say, it's a continuum, right? So there's a range of adaptations that allow trees to deal with fire in different ways. But I would say, I'll contrast the two ends of the spectrum, right? And one is like giant sequoia. And so that's everything about that species. It's adapted to withstand fire, right? To experience fire, to live through it, and to continue go on and growing and reproducing, right? And so, the adaptations are that it grows fast. So that's real important to get tall and get your needles above your leaves above the flame length, right? And then the other thing is it puts on really thick bark. And bark is a really fantastic insulator against fire. Whereas the other end of the spectrum is lodgepole pine, and particularly the variety that occurs in the Rocky Mountains. Its whole approach is it dies by fire, but that creates the space for its offspring to grow. And so,
Okay.
this tree holds its cones in the canopy. The cone scales are basically glued shut with this resin, and then when the fire passes through, it kills the mature trees, but then the heat causes those cone scales to release, to open up and release the seeds. The seeds drop down on the forest floor, and then there's no leaf litter and stuff on the forest floor, so they land on bare mineral soil, and then they're able to germinate and then grow without the competing light competition from the adult trees. And so their whole system is structured such that, like, fire is relatively rare, but when it does happen, it kills the majority of adults, and then that allows the offspring to establish.
Very different and interesting sort of evolutionary approaches to dealing with fire. So treatments are available. Different trees are going to fare better in certain situations. Maybe I guess the next question is, how well are state and federal forest management organizations doing at sort of implementing these measures?
I think there's a lot of variability there. I think that at the state level, like states like Washington State, their Department of Natural Resources is really well staffed with people who, they're coming from research backgrounds and stuff like that, and they're thinking about basically how fire risk is changing with climate change, what that means for vegetation and stuff like that. And so I think there are places where there's a lot of people thinking about these things and trying to come up with solutions. At the federal level, with this influx of money I talked about, they're better able to do the work that needs to be done. But basically, we need to build a whole new workforce there because it's been allowed to dwindle as budgets have shrunk. And we need more people to do the work. And that's not just government people, right? That's like contractors and stuff who can do the work that the state and federal agencies pay to have done. I think the other thing, though, that we got to keep in mind is that there are state level policies in some states that govern what happens in forests. And then there is federal rules. So, for example, the U.S. Forest Service has the Forester's Handbook, and that dictates basically the kind of the sideboards in which a manager can make decisions. And I think a lot of the policies that we have developed, while useful when developed, need to adapt to deal with changing conditions and the changing climatic conditions. And a great example, we were talking about tree species, and the guidelines for reforestation after disturbance in the Forest Service rules are very constrained in terms of where your seeds can come from and the species mix and stuff like that. It dictates all of that stuff. And the idea was to make sure the right genetic material and the right species mix is going back on the landscape. The problem is that the climate is changing so fast that relatively constrained envelope in which the guidelines make you look for genetic material and species mix may not be appropriate for the place you're trying to reforest, given how quickly the climate is changing and how much it's likely to change in the future.
And it sounds like it may be beneficial in cases to sort of have different approaches and then be able to, I guess, have, in theory, some data that better informs, well, we tried this, it didn't work, but we're learning as a result of that what we might want to do into the future.
Yeah. And I think, you raise a huge point there. So, there's been an idea out there for a long time, and it's this idea of adaptive management. We make a choice, we do something, and then having the ability to adapt to changing conditions requires that we measure the response. And then if we're not getting the response we want, we start again. We make a change, right? And we try and achieve the objective that we're after. And I think that, as the pace of climate change increases, that sort of adaptive management feedback loop is going to become a lot more important. And so one of the things that's going to require is we're going to actually have to spend some money monitoring stuff. We kind of give monitoring short shrift right now.
Yeah, it seems hard to, you know, shift to what the future needs to be if you're not, looking at how things are performing in the current conditions.
Yeah.
Well, the clearly the Forest Service is trying to make an effort. You have certain states that are in a good place, but it sounds like in general there's a need to have more folks, involved in this field and being able to treat stuff. I guess in hearing you talk, it's like one of my worries is like, well, how do you scale up quickly so that all the forests aren't treated, or a large portion treated by these mega fires, which obviously mean that you lose a huge portion of the trees versus, losing maybe smaller trees and still having the forest, intact for the most part.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think one thing is that we're going to continue to have some large fires on these forests, right? Because of that scaling up challenge, right? But recognizing that just because we have a big fire doesn't mean that the entire area that burned is some quote unquote ecological disaster, right? So in any big fire, there's usually a pretty sizable portion of it that we get good fire effects, so that they're ecologically appropriate fire effects for that particular forest type. And I think one of the ways that we go about scaling up is recognizing that we can use those areas that have recently burned as places to work from, right? So you have a fire footprint and you've had a first entry of fire into a forest and you've still got a lot of green trees, and adjacent to that you've got unburned forest, and you can go in and use kind of that recently burned area as a backstop against fire spreading, managed fire spreading beyond where you want it to.
I think one of the things that in hearing you talk is making me think that we all need to get more used to the idea of fire, and that having fire isn't a bad thing, and that embracing a certain amount of fire is actually a good thing. The other piece I'm in talking about sort of this green field, I guess, if you will, when you've had a place burn, what, it sounds like it causes potential for like a fire break. What should we be thinking in terms of rehabilitating that space? In other words, is there an opportunity for us to help kind of accelerate that forest path back to being more heterogeneous and fire resilient?
There's no future where we don't have fire, right? Especially in the West, we live in flammable landscapes. They're becoming more flammable, and so it's really a question of how do we want our fire? How do we want that fire interacting with the vegetation? How at risk do we want our communities? And if we want to protect our communities and our watersheds, it's about having more of the right kinds of fire on the landscape. In terms of the rehabilitation of these kind of severely burned areas where you have high tree mortality, um, you know, assuming it's a forest where that's not the right type of fire regime, right? So a lodgepole pine, you would just let it go, and it's going to seed itself in. But if we're in, say, a forest type where the seeds would be consumed in that kind of hot fire, so like a ponderosa pine forest or something like that, the what we don't want to do is replant tomorrow's high severity wildfire risk problem, and so
Right.
we need to be thoughtful in the way we approach reforestation, and so we don't want to plant super dense. We don't want to plant all one species. What you need to do is acknowledge that there are some places on these landscapes where we will be able to replant trees, and then there are going to be places on these landscapes where pretty much no matter how much money we spend replanting, we're never going to reestablish trees because they're warmer and drier than they were. And, they're just not going to support trees. They're going to be shrubs or grassland.
Well, not simple stuff.
Yeah.
And I guess you wouldn't expect it to be, but what can we do to help? What needs to take place so that we can, accelerate our efforts to get to those ecosystems that we need that will enable our forests to be more sustainable in a changing climate?
Yeah. I think there's a few different fronts on which people can engage. If you live in the wildland urban interface, so if you live, your house is built in a neighborhood with flammable vegetation around and stuff like that, the number one thing you can do is follow, the FireWise recommendations and get your house prepared so that if a fire happens nearby, your house is not a casualty. So that's number one. Number two, anyone who lives in the West has breathed some pretty foul air in the last, 5 to 10 years at some point. And, recognizing that the only way that we don't have prolonged degraded air quality from these kind of extreme wildfires is if we are more tolerant of lesser amounts of smoke more often, right? So prescribe burning, manage natural ignitions. We're going to have smoke in the air one way or another, and so it's about you know recognizing that some smoke delivered in a smaller dose is way less harmful to us than tons of smoke delivered in a very high dose, right? And then finally, I think part of it is reaching out to your elected officials, making it clear that dealing with this is really important, and then we're going to have to make some investments to do that. And I think those are kind of the three big opportunities.
I like that, opportunities. And it sounds like in addition to helping get more investment, that those of us who are out in that space, by helping work with our neighbors, getting our property more equipped, I'm going to go out on a limb and say it's probably also beneficial to all of these folks that are fighting wildfire, right? So this one less structure they have to
Yeah.
worry about defending and putting their life on the line for.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean that, I have a number of friends that work in wildland fire, and when they're trying to figure out the suppression strategy, there's a lot of time spent in helicopters looking at the landscape and figuring out, balancing where can like if I'm making the decision of where a fire crew is going to make, try and dig fire line, it's balancing the risk to that crew and then where are people's homes, and increasingly the wildfire behavior that we're seeing is so extreme that in order to not kill people, the fire managers are having to pull people further back, right? Which means that there are increasingly more homes inside the fire line. And you gotta imagine that's probably a really tough pill to swallow when you've spent your career trying to protect people's homes, and now your choice is, basically I let this neighborhood burn or I really risk killing people. And
Yeah.
and it's like the best thing that we can do from a perspective of working with wildland firefighters in that regard is making sure that if they have to pull back, your home is less likely to burn because it's well prepared, that you've managed the fuels around it and you've managed the home envelope so it's less likely to catch fire from an ember.
Well, it sounds like no matter where we sit, we all have a role to play in, helping reduce the risk of wildfire and better manage our forests, in terms of fire. Well, Matt, thanks for coming on and sharing some of your knowledge. Definitely feel a little bit smarter when it comes to wildfire, and thanks for all the work that you're doing in the space.
Thanks, Jason. I appreciated the conversation.
So, Flora, Thomas, what did you guys think about the interview with Matt?
Oh, I loved it. I feel like it's such a relevant topic, kind of everywhere right now. I'm in the Canary Islands and we're even having some bad wildfire, even recently this past weekend. So, yeah, it definitely feels like a really important topic to cover. And I definitely think that it kind of gives us all a lot to think about as we move forward with, how are we going to deal with these fires? How do we plan to rebuild? Do we plan to rebuild? Where do we build? Definitely a lot of directions to go from there. I think while, Matthew was talking, I kept thinking back to some of the historical context, particularly in North America, in kind of the Northern California area. There's a really long history of tribes like the Hupa or the Yurok using controlled burns to manage forests. So I'm definitely curious to see how people will take that as a strategy moving forwards. It made me think about NIMBY for sure, not in my backyard. How do we facilitate this as a viable option for people who are living near these areas?
Yeah, I think it is easy to sort of label, wildfire as bad until you understand the context. And I think Matt did a nice job of explaining that, right? That fire's
Mhm.
natural. It's it's always been around, and it's going to continue to be around. And so we need to help get our forests back to a place where they're, more resilient. And part of
Mhm.
that, ironically, is doing more prescribed burns, at least in certain landscapes. Thoughts from your end, Thomas?
Well, look, the jury had been out in my mind for a long time around the value of prescribed burns from a climate perspective, right?
Mm.
Like, I mean, I can understand from an asset protection perspective, but I'm now leaning towards the fact that in certain forest types, yeah, it could probably be a useful tool because it allows those larger trees to mature. And I wholeheartedly agree with Matt. We've got to move away from these monocultures. We've got to have different varieties in there to break up the forest. Like, I mean, I regularly, when I look at footage after forest fires have gone through, I look at like what trees around houses ended up being saved, and often it's things like the English oak and other deciduous
Mm.
trees, whereas the conifers and eucalypts and so forth, the fire just continues to run through them. So having that break and moving away from these monocultures in forestry operations, I think, is going to be really important.
Absolutely. And I mean, that feels so across the board when we're talking about the effects of climate change. In the Western US, we're seeing the Western red cedars have this massive die off. And right now, it's assumed that that's climate change, drought stress. But it's the same thing where the solution that people are putting out there for forest management is diversify, diversify, diversify. So I absolutely see the merit there.
And there are other benefits from this too. And I mean, as Jason and I recently saw on a ride in the Coast Range in Oregon, where all these Doug fir had been put in, and root rot
Mm.
had traveled from one tree to the next unabated, and they had to clear cut it. But what the Forest Service did was replace that with mixed species.
Yeah, I think, Matt highlighted the, Washington Department of Ecology and kind of the science-based approach that they're taking. And I think, having having folks that are, steeped in the science, looking at what the data are telling us and being able to continue to sort of iterate is going to be key, because we don't know, we can't predict what the future is going to bring. We know there are going to be warmer temperatures. We know there's going to be more fire, but which species end up, over the long term faring better, there's clearly going to need to be some trial and error. So being able to deviate from the normal playbook feels like an important thing. And, I think the other thing worth calling out, as we're talking about all this, is, we can make our forests more resilient, and we should, but we also need to be more responsible in terms of, where and how we develop in the wildland, urban interface.
Yeah, and I think it's important to remember too that, well, from studies I found in Australia, 75% of fires are started by humans. And if we can stop living in these areas, then, backyard burns and things like that end up getting out of control and taking out entire forests. We've basically reduced that risk.
Yeah. And I really do feel like step one is going to be just halting that development. We were talking a little bit, Jason and I, about the Oregon wildfire risk map, which is just such an interesting thing to kind of follow, because Oregon released this wildfire risk map, and immediately, the Bureau was flooded with so much feedback from people who were like, my house has been wrongly assigned, my insurance has changed, I can't live where I want to live now. And so it will be interesting to see how people try to continue to live in these areas. And that's the same in places like Florida, which are having just also wild insurance crises, as people who have houses in areas where we've got rising sea levels, are trying to figure out what to do from there.
Yeah, it's complicated. And, it's unfortunate because there are going to be situations where, your house loses value, but we can't go on pretending that there's not a problem, right? Climate
Hmm.
change is making extreme weather events, things like fire much worse. And so we need to pull off the Band-Aid and realize, A, we can't keep developing in these areas in good conscience. And B, let's be eyes wide open about where there's risk. And then, you know,
Hmm.
taking measures in the form of basic things like steel roofs and things like hardy plank siding that, help you be more resilient when there is fire that comes through.
Along those lines, Jason, I think this is a sort of a bit of an indirect call for greater urban density. And I think there are a lot of benefits of not just reducing the fire risk, both to humans, structures, but there are all these other things that we've talked about in previous episodes around CO2 emissions associated with density, right? So you go and build a house in the forest, you have to have a long driveway to get there, lots of pipe work, electrical infrastructure, whatever it might be. Or let's say you are off grid, you still need a massive battery and all these assets that can't be shared with the rest of society because you built your house in this little off grid bubble. So it ends up being really expensive from a carbon intensity perspective, despite the fact that it looks all clean and green. It really isn't compared to building in a more densely populated area. And then, sure, have the road out to the forest so that you can jump on your mountain bike and head out there in the weekend and go and experience it. But living in the middle of it where you have to drive a long distance to the supermarket, to get to the school, to get to work, or whatever it might be, is really not the best thing from a carbon perspective.
Great point. And also, by the way, awesome plug for episode 63, where we talk about housing as a climate solution. So if you haven't given a listen, you should go do that.
Both great points, you guys. I guess in addition to you plugging density, Thomas, I would say that the reality is we can be designing our small towns to be denser as well. And, making it more walkable, climate friendly, and, as we've said, have them out of harm's way. So we're not making, the job of trying to curtail or control these wildfires that much harder. Well, I think that's a good segue into the question, we try to always ask, which is what can we do? And we've got two options this week. The first is we'd like to ask folks to call your representative and tell them to increase federal funding for wildfire risk mitigation. As Matt mentioned in the interview, we've got a good start with some of the recent federal bills that have passed, but it's going to take a lot more cash to get our forests to a place where they're truly, more resilient.
And for our second option, which we've, already talked about a lot this episode, if you live in an area with more fire risk, get involved. Contacting your local government and calling for an end to development in the wildland-urban interface.
And look, I'd like to throw in a third option, if I may. Grab your mountain bike, get out there. Go and ride these forests and appreciate them for what they are, because then you'll feel even more driven to look after them.
Great point, you guys. Well, that's it for this week's episode. If you haven't already, take a moment to sign up for our monthly newsletter, short on fluff, full of facts, and good action opportunities when it comes to climate. Climate Optimist is made possible by Climate Stewards Collective. You can find us on the web at climateoptimist.co. And don't forget to follow us on social at Climate Optimist Podcast.